welcome aboard. You know, our travels take us to a lot of different parts of the world, and one of the most interesting is Fraser Island. And after having visited the island several times, I decided in 1986 to produce a documentary on it. Now, you're about to see that documentary, which is called K'gari Fraser Island. It's never ever been seen before. Some aspects of it are no longer relevant. In fact, towards the end of it, you'll hear a mention of logging on the island, which has now been completely banned and shut down by the Queensland government. But for the rest of it, it not only represents a detailed look at one of the most unusual and beautiful places in the world, but it also has, I guess, a degree of historical appeal. And you'll find that you'll be seeing aspects of the island which are no longer there, but which are still totally relevant. Let's visit K'gari, Fraser Island. For hundreds of thousands of years, the waters of the Pacific have lapped her white sandy shores. On the 20th of May 1770, Captain James Cook, on his northward voyage of exploration, recorded the first European sighting of the island. At 10 a.m. we passed at the distance of 4 miles a black bluff head or point of land on which a number of the natives were assembled, which occasioned my naming it Indian Head, he wrote. Fraser Island lies off the Queensland coast just south of the Tropic of Capricorn, thrusting northeastwards into the Pacific. With a length of almost 80 miles and an average width of 9 miles, it has an area of 617 square miles, making it the largest sand island in the world. It was called by the natives K'gari or Paradise. It has a stunning variety of plant and animal life, with huge stands of rainforest interspersed with vast sand dunes and scrubland. There are more than 40 lakes, each of them defying accepted laws of nature by remaining stable in sand. The shoreline is the modern highway, giving the visitor access to the beaches, dunes and rainforest. The keen observer can watch the proliferation of wildlife as it grows and develops, the interaction of the Brumbian dingo, the glacier-like sand blows as they move across this jewel of an island. Hi, I'm Chris Conroy. The Australian Aborigines have a theory about the creation of Fraser Island. They say that the spirit of paradise, K'gari, was helping the great god's messenger Yendinji to create the world, and after they'd created the mountains and the continents, she felt a little tired, so she lay down in the ocean embracing some rocks and fell asleep. When she awoke, she said to Yendinji, "This is the most beautiful place we've made. Can I stay?" And after much arguing backwards and forwards, Yendinji relented, changed her into a sand island, and here she lays to this time. The island is now called Fraser Island. It's the world's largest sand island, which is just the first of many firsts and many marvellous aspects of Fraser Island, which fascinate the most casual of visitors. Come with me and I'll show you K'gari, Fraser Island. The ancient race of Aborigines who once inhabited K'gari are gone now, victims of poisoning, war, influenza, venereal disease. But their footprints are indelible in the shifting sands. One of the most graphic indications of ancient Aboriginal habitation on Fraser Island are the middens. Now these are pipi, yugari, or as the Aboriginals call them, wong shells. They dug them out of the sand and ate them and threw them in a great big heap. Now over years and years and years, those piles or middens built up to quite enormous proportions. This one appears to have been about 200 metres in diameter. The interesting thing about this one is, as you see behind me, there's vegetation on those foreshore dunes. Now this is effectively the end of a huge sand blow which for the last 4,000 or 5,000 years or whatever has been marching through the island. Because of that vegetation on the foreshore dunes, the sand blower is now no longer being fed with new sand. and it's uncovering this midden, and there's every reason to believe that this midden has not been seen for several thousand years and has only very recently been uncovered. Now, the pippy shells are interesting. The ones on top, obviously, are the newer ones. This one is an excellent example and hasn't really suffered the ravages of sand abrasion. Now, they're extremely hard, so it takes a long while for the sand to eat them away, but nevertheless, that edge there has been completely cut off and rounded, and it's extremely thin down there. Some of these other ones are showing signs of even more sand erosion and having been bleached and lost their colour in the sand. By the way, the Aboriginals didn't only have a taste for wongs or eugeries, they also enjoyed sea snails. There is a sea snail shell there which hasn't been broken at all. That's been worn through by sand erosion. So there's every reason to believe, as I said, that this midden could be 4 or 5 or even 6,000 years old and has never been seen before by white men. Another one of the fascinating secrets that the sands of Fraser Island are constantly revealing as they conduct their migrations to the west. It's fascinating stuff, this sand, as you'll see. One of the most fascinating aspects of Fraser Island is the way in which it was formed. The rivers of New South Wales, north of a line through about Sydney, are constantly eroding sand from the Great Dividing Range and washing it to the sea. Now, there's a northerly set up the New South Wales coast and the southern Queensland coast, and that carries the sand north and it rolls it over and conducts it north. Indian Head is the only rock outcrop on Fraser Island. Now, it's been there for countless millions of years, and over those millions of years, Indian Head has obstructed the northward flow of current and caused the sand that's being carried north by that current to be deposited. The current has slowed down and eddies have formed and it swirls, and the sand loses its impetus and it settles on the floor of the ocean. Now, over millions and millions of years, the island has actually built up. The most amazing thing about it is that the bedrock is 2,000 feet below sea level, which means that Fraser Island is one of the largest single bodies of sand in the world. Its topography changes all the time, its map plan view changes all the time due to the forces of tide, wind and water, and that means that Fraser Island is effectively alive. The sand is constantly washed ashore by the ocean. The prevailing southeasterly winds pick it up and blow it towards the inland. As the vegetation goes through its life cycles and as a result of storms, breaches in the foreshore vegetation occur. The natural barrier to the movement of the sand is thus removed and it commences its march inland. The resultant sand blows are huge and imposing, engulfing entire valleys and sometimes lakes. This is Lake Wabi at 35 feet, the deepest on the island. Due to its low pH of 6, it contains the greatest variety of fish with 9 compared to 2 or 3 in most of the other lakes. It is an Aboriginal sacred site, and due to the magnitude of the sand blow, its surrounds tell the story of the ancient history of the island, revealing Melaleucas up to 3,000 years old. It is being engulfed by the sand blow at the rate of 13 feet per year. The Aboriginals had lived on Fraser Island for 30,000 years and represented, in physique and intelligence, some of the finest in Australia. Escaped Moreton Bay convict David Bracewell, who was accepted as a member of the Yuin-Mundi tribe, estimated that in 1852 there were 2,000 natives on the island. Whilst they were unpredictable and greatly feared by early settlers, they believed that white men were the ghosts of their ancestors, and there are many stories of fugitives from the savage penal settlement on Moreton Bay, such as Bracewell, James Davis and Harry Youlden, being accepted as members of the tribes and living with them for many years. By 1896 their numbers had dwindled to a dozen mournful, opium-poisoned and disease-ridden parodies of their free and warlike ancestors who were gone, never to return. Plans to establish an Aboriginal reserve on the island founded when Andrew Petrie, searching for the graves of Captain Fraser and his crew in 1842, discovered substantial stands of saturnae, kauri and hoop pine in the extensive rainforest. The genius of the Fraser Island sawmilling industry and its founder was William Pettigrew. Arriving in Brisbane aboard the ship Fortitude in 1849, Pettigrew established a steam-powered circular sawmill at the corner of William and Margaret Streets in Brisbane. His operation was successful despite some early setbacks, and in 1862, searching for new forests, he persuaded Petrie's son Tom to take him to Fraser Island. He was mightily impressed by the timber on the island and immediately built a sawmill at Maryborough, which cut its first timber in 1863, the logs having been punted across the Great Sandy Straits from the island. Pettigrew was later joined by Wilson Hart and Company and Hine and Son, who are still operating in Maryborough today. The romance of the early sawmills was overshadowed by the adventures and tribulations of the timber getters who lived and worked on the island. They were constantly under threat from falling logs, snakebite and hostile blacks, and one of the most famous, Yankee Jack Piggott, after whom Yankee Jack Creek is named, was clubbed and speared to death at Sandy Cape in 1864. Bullock teams were used to haul felled trees to the railway line built by Edward Armitage. Armitage convinced Wilson Hart and Company and Hine and Son to fund the construction of 9 miles of track, which wound tortuously through the forests in the Urang to Woongoolva Creek areas of the island. The first locomotive, affectionately called Doris, was designed and built by Armitage in Maryborough and with her sisters served faithfully for many years. In the early years, tallow wood was the timber most taken, and timber from Fraser Island was shipped all over the world. It was used to build the Suez Canal and rebuild London's Falmouth Dock. Transport of the logs across the Sandy Straits was always a problem, and once again, William Pettigrew's genius pioneered the technology to overcome the difficulties. In late 1863, he set about the conversion of the stern-wheel steamer Granite City into a self-powered, self-loading logger renamed Nearing. She served faithfully until a sandbank in the Maritime River ended her career in 1892. Today, Fraser Island timber is managed very carefully by the Forestry Department. It is selectively logged, with each tree felled under forestry supervision. The forests of Fraser will endure to generate wonder and pleasure for many generations to come. You know, you'd think with modern day technology that the old lighthouse would have been superseded with sophisticated electronic equipment, with the way in which technology is advancing on an almost hourly basis. It's really amazing to think that the old lighthouse is still a viable piece of navigational equipment. In fact, this one on Sandy Cape on the northern tip of Fraser was installed in 1870, and it has quite an interesting history from quite a few points of view. For instance, the construction. The entire lighthouse was built out of cast iron plates which had flanges on them which mated up and which were all fitted together like a giant Meccano set. Though it was cast in England, it was brought by ship from England to Maryborough. It was loaded on a barge, brought to Fraser Island, and then bullock drays dragged it up this quite tall sand hill before it was erected. Now that was a really incredible feat of moving heavy pieces of machinery, particularly for those years. The light has been converted from kerosene, where it had a huge lens which filled virtually the entire inside of the top of the lighthouse here, into an electric one. It's 110 volts, 1,000 watts, and its beam is enormously enhanced, in fact up to 1 million candle power, by the glass lenses which you see mounted around the outside on the revolving carriage of the light. Now, lighthouse technology varies from area to area, but fundamentally the light is there to shine all of the time through the dark hours. In this case, it's supplemented by a radio beam, and whatever happens, the light has to continue to shine. Now, I'll give you an example of what would happen here if total electrical failure occurred. and it was necessary for the lighthouse keeper to operate it manually. Now, there are 2 electric motors, there are 2 diesel generators downstairs, there are backup systems for absolutely everything. There's an alarm system here so that if the light does stop for any reason, the keeper knows within 25 seconds, but it's possible for all those things to fail. They are simply artefacts of man, so they are subject to failure. Now, if that happens, what he does, he runs up the stairs, arrives here panting and breathless, takes this kerosene lamp out of here, he installs it in place of the electrical lamp up in the top of the light there. He puts a crank handle on there, and he engages these gears up here on the wheel, and he stands there and he cranks the light around. Now, not only that, but he has to hold a stopwatch in one hand to make sure that he cranks 1 revolution every 20 seconds. Now, that hasn't happened. It's gone close a couple of times, and the chances of it happening are remote. But there it is, the replacement Sandy Cape light in case the whole thing, a kerosene lantern. The waters around Fraser Island have claimed many ships over the years, most famous among them being the Stirling Castle. Captained by James Fraser, who had a reputation for incompetence, the ship's complement included his wife Eliza, said by Henry Youlden to be a liar, profane, artful and wicked. Striking a reef in the Swain Group off Gladstone on the 22nd of May 1836, she quickly broke up. The crew were captured by Fraser Island natives during their bid to reach Moreton Bay, and Fraser was speared to death. Eliza was held captive for 3 weeks, finally being rescued by the convict David Bracewell with assistance from John Graham, another convict who had also lived among the natives. Eliza ended her days in an asylum in England, but will forever be remembered for having given her name to this savage and beautiful island. A more recent but equally famous wreck is that of the Maheno. The Maheno was one of those fortunate vessels which has enjoyed fame rather than notoriety right through her long life. She was built in Dumbarton, Scotland in 1905, 5,277 tonnes, and was one of the very first ships ever built with steam turbine power, initially with triple screws, but later in her life she was converted to twin screws to conserve some of the energy and of course make her a little cheaper to operate. Now, she plied the Tasman Sea and also the Melbourne to Sydney route early in her career and was responsible for a trans-Tasman speed record which stood for 25 years. She was very, very fast. She was a roller, and a lot of the trimmers who used to wheelbarrows of coal around the old ships in those days to avoid them listing and try and keep them more stable, refused to sail aboard her because she was so difficult. She had tall masts, she was quite narrow-gutted, which of course was one of the reasons for her speed. So the trimmers would make themselves scarce when crews were being taken on. But you could walk aboard the ship in Auckland, pay £5, and 5 minutes later sail for Sydney and expect to be there in about 2.5 or 3 days. In 1915, she was impressed into service as a hospital ship and carried 16,000 wounded from France to England in 40 crossings during the First World War. She finished her years in around about 1933 or 34 when she was sold for scrap to Japan, and during a tow in July 1935 she encountered a hurricane along with her tow ship off Fraser Island here. By the way, she was being towed by the anchor chain, which finally gave up the strain after about 2 days of heavy blow, and she fetched ashore here on Fraser Island. I guess her least dignified period of life was during the Second World War, when the Australian Army saw her as being an excellent target for bombs, and that's one of the reasons that the decks are so badly pitted and full of holes, and one of the reasons that the ship's back is broken. But for quite a few years after she went aground here, she was quite a magnificent sight, looking pristine and almost brand new. In fact, when she did fetch ashore, the carpets, the linings were in all of these cabins and saloons. She even had an organ which ended up in a church in Maryborough aboard, and a baby grand piano. In fact, one of the customs officers who came aboard to guard her during the attempts to refloat her said that you could fish anywhere around the boat at high tide and catch whatever fish you wanted, and you could swim down in the engine room free of problems with sharks. Now the Mahina is sinking into the sands. Her iron will stain the sands of Fraser Island for hundreds of years to come. It'll take a while before the wreck finally sinks and disappears. And she's still here as a mute testimony to the power not only of the ocean and the weather, but to the sands of Fraser Island. The western side of the island, free of the effects of constant wind and waves, presents an entirely different aspect. Behind me, behind that mangrove stand over there, there's a lagoon of about 300 acres which is formed by a depression in the sand. Now the outflow from that lagoon, combined with the tidal effects of Harvey Bay, have formed Watumba Inlet, one of the largest inlets on the northwestern end of the island. Watumba Creek there has claimed quite a few four-wheel drives who thought that they could make it across at low tide, but the sand is very soupy and it just totally engulfed the four-wheel drives. Now it's dead low tide at the moment. At high tide, all of those sand flats behind me are completely inundated. At the moment it's the feeding ground for a large variety of waders, seagulls, egrets, herons. All of the waders are out there picking up the tiny little crabs and oysters and things that feed or that live in the sand. It appears to be changeless and timeless, but close observation reveals again that the island is all the time generating and regenerating life. For instance, this stand of mangroves, when I was here a year ago, was alive, but due to some effect, some cyclic effect of wind and tide of the life cycle of the mangroves, as you can see, they've completely died. The mangroves behind me are still perfectly healthy. Another indication of the way in which Fraser Island is constantly changing. Life is building, maturing, dying, and then regenerating again. Another one of the fascinations of Fraser Island. There are about 300 dingoes on Fraser Island. They are unique in that due to their isolation, they are the purest strain of dingo in eastern Australia. There is some fear that domestic dogs may pollute the strain, but the dingoes seem more interested in eating the dogs than mating with them. Until about 60 years ago, their main diet was the large doggy crabs which lived in the beach. These have disappeared, probably because of traffic along the beach, and the dingoes now cut out and kill old and sick brumbies and young foals. They usually hunt in pairs or packs, one distracting the mare whilst the others run the foal until it drops from exhaustion. It is quickly killed and eaten. This foal was fortunate that the dingo was alone, his obvious hunger giving him the courage to harass the mare in an attempt to split the foal away. It is said that the dingo population is artificially high due to feeding by tourists. The brumbies have a different story to tell. In 1879, George Dickon and Harry Aldridge formed a partnership to operate a 25 square mile cattle and horse run on the eastern side of the island. Aldridge bred Arabs for the Indian Army on the lease, which was located just north of Yurong. Dickon was a Clydesdale breeder on the mainland and shipped his bloodstock along with Aldridge's Arabs. Not long after moving to the island, Dickon met and married a widow named Mary on the mainland. Mary had a one-year-old son named Victor. A year or so after moving to the island, Victor was kidnapped by the cannibal chief Durham boy who took him as his son. He was rescued after about 3 weeks, none the worse for his ordeal. The run lasted a few years, dispatching at least 2 consignments of cavalry horses to the Indian Army and then petered out. Dickon and Aldridge left a legacy on the island, the Brumbies. The Arabs and Clydesdales interbred, and the mix of the 2 strains can still be seen in the wild horses. Their adaptation to the island is so complete that they face starvation and death if they are relocated to the mainland. Their gait and hooves have adapted to the soft sand and they cannot be shod. The sand they ingest whilst eating the vegetation ensures a short but happy life of about 6 years. And despite over 100 years of interbreeding, there are some superb specimens to be seen. As with most feral animals which come into regular contact with man, the Brumbies identify humans as a source of food and can become aggressive if none is forthcoming. For this reason, feeding of the dingoes and Brumbies is discouraged. Travellers on the beaches right around the island will observe thousands of freshwater springs bubbling up through the sand and running across the beach to the sea. It has been estimated that Fraser Island discharges an incredible 80 million gallons of fresh water into the sea each day, and because of the time taken to filter through the sand, the rate of discharge remains constant regardless of seasonal changes. Fraser Island is the world's largest natural freshwater reservoir. When one considers the high annual rainfall, almost twice that of the adjacent mainland, and the huge mass of sand involved, allied with the fact that apart from a few feet near the surface it is saturated, some idea of the sheer volume can be gained. The resort at Orchid Beach uses spear pumps for its water, and when the water leaves a tap, it is 80 years old and absolutely pure. I guess Fraser Island is full of phenomena, one of which is its lakes. Now, there are over 40 pure freshwater lakes on Fraser Island, and when one considers that virtually all of the island is sand, the question must arise as to how those lakes remain stable in sand. Have a look here and I'll show you. I'm going to draw you a map of the island going from sea level over there to sea level here. This is the ocean, that's the Great Sandy Straits. Now, the island comes up there like that. Okay, now I've already said that it extends over 2,000 feet below sea level. It goes all the way down there. Now obviously the saltwater table is through there. And what happens is rain falls on the island, and of course sand is an excellent container for fresh water, so the water soaks into the island, and because fresh water is less dense than salt, it forms a huge lens-shaped reservoir of water which floats on the salt water with which the major underwater bulk of the island is indurated, and you have a huge lens of fresh water. Now, where the lens is exposed by the topography of the island dropping below the water level, you have a window lake. Up here you have a perch lake. Now, I'll tell you about perch lakes later. Come and I'll show you what a window lake represents. Window lakes are relatively easy to understand. We've all done this when we were kids. Gotten near the edge of the water, scooped out a hole in the sand, and almost by miracle, it fills up with water. Now, it really isn't a miracle because all you're doing is uncovering the natural water table in the sand, and you're making exactly what is represented on Fraser Island by a window lake. The story of the perch lakes is effectively the story of the life cycle of the island. A sandblow breaches the foreshore dunes and starts to march inland. Now, the further it goes, the closer it gets to areas of vegetation. The vegetation goes through its normal life cycles. Trees die and they drop their leaves. Now, the sandblow has depressions in it. Obviously, it's made up of dunes, and there are depressions in it, some of them quite large. The leaves fall into those depressions, and they're trapped there, as these are, by eddies in the wind and by other forces, or by rain. Now, the rain here is by courtesy of my trusty watering can. It rains on those leaves and on the dead vegetation. Almost immediately, that starts to decompose. More vegetation falls on top of it, more rain falls on top of that vegetation, until finally the decomposing vegetation mixed with the sand forms peat. Now that process is enhanced by the fact that bacteria live in that decomposing vegetation, and they produce cilia, which are tiny little fibres which enhance the bonding process that takes place in the peat. Now, over an extended period of time, a huge saucer of peat is built up, and that saucer is impermeable to water. So what happens is we have a lake actually trapped in virgin sand by that layer of peat. Now, obviously the sand blower is a dynamic force. It keeps moving all the time, so new sand is blown in on top of it all the time, new vegetation falls in, and it really builds up a solid layer of peat and causes that superb saucer of absolutely crystal clear water to be formed in the sand. Now, I said it's crystal clear. It's also the purest water in the world. It's around about 99.9% pure, which means that there aren't many nutrients in it, and the life which does live in it, the amphibians and the fish, have adapted to water of that low nutrient level. A true miracle. There are other forces at work in the sands. A walk along one of the creeks reveals all of the wonders of a clear mountain stream, the water bubbling over obstructions and tumbling around the gentle curves. The obstructions, however, are not rocks and stones, but the trunks and branches of trees and palms which have fallen across the creek. Progress is difficult because of the profusion of pandanus, screw palm, she oak and cottontail, and one is forced to take to the water, which is quite deep in places. Stand still for a moment and you'll find your toes being nibbled by the freshwater shrimps which abound, and which are in turn chased and devoured by the Australian bass and carp. To the naturalist, whether amateur or professional, Fraser Island is a treasure trove. The botanist can marvel at the number of species of palm, orchid, wildflower, fern and rainforest vegetation which thrives in the sand, and the bird and animal watcher can feast on the abundant wildlife to be seen. Whilst there are a great number of different species, the population levels are comparatively small. This is thought to be due to the relatively low proportion of available protein in the vegetation. Grass in the forested areas is sparse, and trees and ferns offer little attraction to herbivores. The lucky visitor may glimpse a pretty face or long-tailed wallaby, and possums live in some areas, but there are no koalas, and kangaroos make brief and infrequent visits from the mainland. Bird life is another matter. 300 species have been identified as either living on the island permanently or staying here for periods during their global migrations. This number is greater than the total for the British Isles, and the birdwatcher is entranced by the mix and activity of this huge display. There has been no detailed study of insects, although it is assumed that the island has a similar variety to the adjacent mainland. The Kalula monster, a species of cricket, was discovered in 1976 and is unique to the island. Fraser Island has around about 26 species of lizards, apart from other reptiles such as tortoises, turtles and snakes, of course. And they're typified by this absolutely superb example of a common bearded dragon. Now, he's a bit indignant probably at being called common, but more probably at being disturbed from basking in the sun. He's an absolutely beautiful specimen. He's around about 60 centimetres long. They grow. A large specimen is around about 75 centimetres long. And they have a remarkable defence mechanism. Effectively, they are harmless. They're not capable of inflicting any sort of damage on anything other than their prey. But what they do if they're attacked or they feel threatened is they open them out, displaying that magnificent bright yellow interior, and they expand their ribs to flatten their body out into a saucer shape. Now, at the same time, you can't see it now, but they raise themselves up off the ground and make themselves look about twice as large as their normal size and enormously fierce. Now, in the case of most attackers, particularly casual ones, that will discourage them and they'll go away. But ultimately, they can't even inflict a bite. Those jaws have little bony ridges in there which are slightly serrated, but they're not very strong, and they really can't even bite you very hard. They do an enormous amount of good in getting rid of insects and other pests, particularly mice and rodents, and it really is a shame to kill them, apart from the fact that they are protected all over Australia, so it is illegal to deliberately kill them. Now, we're going to liberate this little fella and allow him to have another bask in the sun and calm down a little. A typical example of the beautiful lizards which abound around Australia and on Fraser Island. The cathedrals, located on the eastern beach just north of Happy Valley, are the result of eons of wind, rain and ocean erosion, these forces having uncovered and sculptured sand, cemented together into soft sandstone and coloured by organic and mineral deposits. The colours shade from white and pale yellow to deep ochre, brown and black. It is thought that the black peat uncovered on the beaches is the residue of lake beds formed during the infancy of the island. The cementing process varies in its firmness, allowing the forces of erosion to sculpt the sand into bizarre cathedral shapes. The beach is home to many species of seabird. Terns, egrets, herons, shearwaters, ibis and many more may be observed, whilst the pied oyster catcher, who pairs for life, goes about the solemn and dignified business of catching pippies in the sand. The skies are dominated by the superb sea eagles, kites and goshawk. Let's join the hawks in our motor glider and enjoy the island from the air. Fraser Island is a paradise for the fishermen. Legend has it that the Aborigines used trained dolphins to herd schools of fish into the shallows, where they were speared. Today, Fraser Island's fishermen, who form the bulk of her visitors, use more sophisticated methods. Boats, some of them more than 20 feet long, are trailed from the population centres of southeast Queensland, sometimes up to 200 miles away, and then hauled laboriously up the length of the island to Waddy Point just north of Indian Head. This is a feat in itself, requiring great determination and a powerful four-wheel drive vehicle. Waddy affords the only practical launching point on the eastern shore, having a sand spit reaching to the west from the point with relatively sheltered water behind. Nevertheless, the soft sand and surf make launching difficult, and there have been cases where entire vehicles have disappeared beneath the sand. These fishermen, competitors in a fishing competition held annually by Orchid Beach Resort, have established a tent city on the back of the beach. They have all the comforts of home with abundant water and generators for light and power to run their freezers, but they are always mindful of the delicate ecological balance of the island, and a day or so after they leave, it is difficult to find traces of their presence. Once launched, the boats must negotiate the surf. This requires skill and courage, and many a skipper has fallen foul of the break and been swamped. Once at sea, the going is easier, and it is a short trip to the fishing grounds. The Gardner Banks, just off the coast, abound in coral bommies or reefs, and these are sought by the fishermen using electronic depth sounders. The lines go down and the action begins. The bait has barely touched the bottom before it is taken, and there ensues a mighty struggle between fish and fishermen before the catch is boated. Then it's back to the beach, with the surf having to be negotiated again on the return journey and the fish are cleaned. It is at this time that the observer can gain some appreciation of the quality and variety of the fish. Snapper, sweetlip, Venus tuskfish, huzzar, mackerel and wahoo are just some of the many varieties of exotic tropical and subtropical species which abound in the island's waters, and all of these will find their way to the tables of delighted gourmets. Perhaps the effort required to reach the banks is a good thing, helping to preserve this valuable resource. The beach fisherman is equally well catered for, with the sand affording a source of natural bait, including sandworms up to 2 metres long and requiring skill and practice to catch, as well as pippies. The pippies live just under the surface of the sand, and they're extremely popular with fishermen as bait. They really are fish killers as far as the surf fish here are concerned. This area of the beach is very heavily trafficked, and the four-wheel drives have actually compressed the sand down and popped these little mounds up, of which represents a pippy of whatever size. You can see them all over the place. Now the bed stretches for about 400 metres along the beach and is an absolute gold mine for a beach fisherman who's looking for one of the best possible available natural baits. Fraser Island's environment and ecological balance is demonstrably fragile. It is unique in the world in many ways, and for these reasons has attracted the attentions of environmentalists. The first controversy to arise was over sand mining, and it resulted in a bitter and protracted court battle between the Fraser Island Defenders organisation called FIDO and several mining companies including Dillingham's and Murphy Ores. The battle culminated at the end of 1976 when all mining ceased. There are, however, several leases still current along the shoreline south of Sandy Cape, but mining is effectively blocked by the federal government's ban on all exports of minerals from the island. Arguments still rage to and fro, with the mining companies citing successful revegetation on the areas of the island already mined and other parts of the east coast, and the environmentalists saying that the entire island should be declared a national park. Timber getting has also aroused its share of controversy. In this area, much positive work has been done by the Queensland Forestry Department in cooperation with the two major sawmills on the mainland, Hine & Son and Wilson & Hart. These efforts have resulted in an extensive study of the beneficial effects of selective logging and regeneration. By far the most potentially damaging force threatening the island is the number of people who visit it. The island is accessible to many more fishermen and tourists than at any other time in the past, and their impact can be seen in the discarded litter along the beach and near the camping areas. Without the continuing efforts of the National Parks and Wildlife Service, the problem would be much worse, and they are to be commended. In recent times, the amount of litter left by visitors has declined, indicating a growing appreciation and sense of responsibility on the part of these people. Fraser Island is part of our heritage as Australians and should be treasured as such. There is not much point, however, in having such a heritage if we are not able to enjoy it. At the very worst, the combination of environmental impacts could cause massive destruction to the island's balance and lead to its demise. There is already evidence of long-term retention of radioactivity in some of the perched lakes. If they can retain this, they can also retain soaps, detergents and sewage. Damage to foreshore dunes and vegetation must be avoided. These systems have a direct effect on the entire ecology of the island right across its width. At best, if the impact is too great, the island may be closed to visitors for long periods. This would be a tragedy, depriving the lovers and admirers of the island of their regular communes with her spirit. The Aborigines who lived here for thousands of years did so in perfect harmony. We can too if we try. Fraser Island has a growing number of friends. Her ability to captivate people, from the most casual visitor through scientists of many disciplines and the organisations who protect her, to state and federal politicians, is not by chance. I'm sure that the spirit of paradise, Kagari, still watches over this gold and green jewel in an emerald sea.